Have you ever stood in the echoing silence of a castle, keep, and felt the immense, crushing weight of the centuries pressing down from the cold stone above? Have you ever imagined the lives and deaths that transpired within those walls, the ambitions that soared like eagles, and the despairs that coiled like serpents in the dark? Power, we are often told, is a mantle worn by the great, but history whispers a more chilling truth. It suggests that sovereignty is not a mantle, but a cage, not a throne, but a tomb. And at the heart of this gilded cage sits the crown, a circlet of metal and stone that is meant to signify divine right, but which can, under the stain of a broken oath, become an instrument of divine retribution. I am your guide on this descent into the shadowed vaults of history, where the glitter of gold is indistinguishable from the glint of a malevolent eye. We shall not be examining the grand tapestries of political succession, but rather the frayed threads of ancestral memory, the folklore that clings to these objects of power like a shroud. For these legends posit a terrifying thesis, that objects, particularly those sanctified by blood and oath, can absorb the moral character of their wearers. They can become vessels of consequence, archives of sin, where a forgotten promise or a cruel betrayal festers for generations. The curse of a crown is not a simple enchantment. It is the slow, inexorable vengeance of memory itself, etched into the very soil and soul of a kingdom. Our journey tonight is a deliberate one, a plunge into a realm where royal regalia becomes a source of profound and existential dread. We will unearth the stories of 5 such cursed crowns from the forgotten corners of the European continent. We shall explore the crown of the Fun King, born of a pact with the marshlands themselves, the diadem of whispers, which drove a dynasty to madness with the voices of its despoiled gods, the iron crown of the usurper, a relic that granted immortality at the cost of the soul, the garland of thorns, which showed a monarch every terrible future, and finally, the sovereign's debt, a crown that repaid its owner's ambition with utter desolation. These are not tales spun for children's entertainment around a flickering hearth. They are collective nightmares that reveal immutable truths about the nature of power, the fragility of oaths, and the terrible price of hubris. If you, like me, feel an inexorable pull towards these darker currents of history, if you find a strange and solemn beauty in these cautionary tales, then I invite you to become a permanent member of this intellectual inquest. Subscribe to our channel and activate the notifications so that you're never absent when we convene to unseal another chapter from the archives of the arcane. As we proceed, I ask you to consider a question, one to carry with you through the coming darkness. Which of these burdens, which of these cursed diadems, would you find the most unbearable to wear? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, for this is not a lecture, but a shared meditation. And now, with the formalities observed, let our journey into the shadowed heart of sovereignty truly begin. Our first specimen lies buried not in a treasure vault, but in the peat and mire of the ancient English fenlands. We speak of the crown of the Fun King, a relic that predates the grand Norman cathedrals and the stone castles that would later dominate the landscape. It was not a thing of gold or silver, but a circlet woven from the raw materials of the swamp itself. Bog iron, dark as coagulated blood, twisted around a frame of petrified reeds, and adorned not with jewels, but with polished fragments of bog oak, black and hard as jet. It was a crown that did not sit upon the land, but was an extension of it, a physical manifestation of the sacred pact between a ruler and the primordial spirits of the marsh. The Fun Kings, it was said, did not rule the fens. They served them, and the crown was their bond. The entity, in this case, is the land itself, an ancient and sentient consciousness that demanded equilibrium. The crown was its voice, its instrument. Its core motivation was not malice, but a brutal, unyielding form of justice. It demanded respect for the delicate balance of water and earth, of life and decay, that defined its domain. The ruler who wore it was granted prosperity. His people were safe from the fevers of the marsh, their cattle were fat, and the reed beds provided all they needed. But this prosperity was conditional. The crown was a constant, tactile reminder of that condition, feeling cool and vital on the brow of a worthy king, but said to grow unervingly warm, almost feverish, on one who harbored thoughts of exploitation. Its supernatural ability was not to cast spells, but to act as a conduit for the land's agony, translating ecological destruction directly into psychological and physical decay for the monarch and his kingdom. The crown's origin was woven into the foundational myth of the first Fun King, a chieftain named Edric who, lost and dying in the bewildering mists, made a desperate plea. He swore that if the spirits of the Fun would guide him to safety, he and his descendants would forever be its guardians, vowing never to drain the waters, fell the ancient oaks, or disturb the sacred peat bogs where the ancestors slept. In response, a figure was said to have risen from the murky water, neither man nor beast, but a being of mud and tangled weeds, and offered him the circlet. It was a coronation by the earth itself. 4 generations, the pact was honored. The Fun Kings ruled in quiet harmony, their small kingdom a strange, waterlogged paradise, viewed with suspicion by the lords of the dry lands, but fiercely loved by its people. The crown remained a symbol of this sacred trust, passed from father to son with solemn ceremony. This delicate balance was shattered in the 9th century with the ascension of King Oswin, a man whose ambitions were as vast and dry as the chalk uplands he so admired. He had traveled to the courts of Wessex and Mercia and seen their great stone halls and sprawling fields of wheat. He returned to his damp kingdom with contempt in his heart, viewing the Fens not as a sacred entity to be served, but as a worthless swamp to be conquered and remade in the image of the powerful Saxon kingdoms. He saw the crown on his brow not as a pact, but as a primitive relic. His council of elders warned him, speaking in hushed tones of the ancient oath. But Oswin was a man of the new age. He declared, "I shall not be king of mud and mist. I shall be king of rich, black earth. We will chain the waters and make this land truly our own." He began his great work with a feverish energy. Hundreds of laborers were put to work digging vast canals, diverting the slow, meandering rivers into straight, efficient channels. Ancient peat bogs, held sacred for centuries, were drained and burned, the air thick for months with a strange, sweet-smelling smoke that made the old folks weep. The crown on his head began to change. The bog iron grew warm to the touch, then hot, leaving a faint red mark on his brow when he removed it. He ignored the sign. As the first great field was plowed where a sacred mere once lay, Oswin held a feast. That night, as he slept, he had his first nightmare. He dreamt he was drowning, not in water, but in thick, cloying mud, his lungs filling with the taste of decay as unseen things slithered against his skin. He awoke, gasping, the crown lying beside his bed, now feeling strangely heavy, its reedy frame oddly damp. The next day, reports came from the new farmlands. The wheat that had sprouted so promisingly was turning black with a strange, slimy rot. The water in the new canals grew stagnant and foul, breeding clouds of biting insects the likes of which had never been seen. A wasting sickness, the Fun shivers, began to sweep through his people, a disease they had been free from for generations. Oswin's own health began to fail. A persistent cough racked his body, and his skin took on a gray, pallid hue. The red mark on his forehead from the crown no longer faded. It deepened into a raw, weeping sore. He began to hear things. The whisper of reeds in his chambers, though the air was still, the suck and pull of mud beneath the stone floors of his hall. The crown was no longer just a crown. It was a torment. It felt as if it were tightening on his skull, feeding his own anxieties and failures directly into his mind. In his final days, it was said he clawed at his head, screaming for his men to remove the crown, but it would not budge, as if it had fused with his very bone. He died not in his bed, but in the half-drained fields of his great project, found face down in the blighted mud, his body wasted and his eyes wide with a terror that had outlived his heart. After his death, the canals collapsed, the rivers reclaimed their ancient paths, and the fens slowly, inexorably swallowed Oswin's works. The crown was never seen again, believed to have been dragged back into the bog, awaiting a king worthy of its pact or another fool ripe for its justice. The legend of the Fun King's crown is a powerful environmental metaphor, a story that encodes a deep, ancestral understanding of ecological balance. The crown itself symbolizes the concept of stewardship. In modern terms, it represents the awesome responsibility that comes with the power to alter an ecosystem. Oswin is the archetypal figure of arrogant modernity, the prideful artisan who believes nature is a raw material to be molded to his will, rather than a complex system to be respected. The curse is not a magical hex. It is a dramatization of ecological collapse. Draining the wetlands leads to soil degradation, the blight, stagnant water, the disease, and the loss of a sustainable way of life. The psychological torment Oswin endures, the nightmares, the whispers, is the personification of ecological guilt, the subconscious recognition that his actions are a profound transgression. The crown, in this analysis, becomes a psychosomatic amplifier, turning the land's suffering into the king's personal agony. It is a primitive but profound illustration of the idea that the health of the ruler and the health of the land are inextricably linked. In our contemporary world, this legend resonates with a chilling new relevance. As we face global climate change, deforestation, and mass extinction, the story of Oswin is no longer a quaint piece of folklore, but a stark and pressing allegory. Our modern crowns, our technologies, our economic systems, our political ideologies grant us unprecedented power to reshape the planet, to drain the modern fens for the promise of short-term gain. The tale serves as a grave warning that such hubris invites a terrible reckoning. The blighted crops of King Oswin are the wildfires, the superstorms, the droughts of our own era. His shivers are the emerging diseases and ecological anxieties that plague our global civilization. The legend persists, not as a ghost story, but as an ever-present truth whispered on the wind. The earth keeps its own accounts, and all debts, eventually, must be paid. The Fun King's crown may be lost to the peat, but its lesson is one we are being forced to relearn the hard way. It reminds us that we are not masters of our environment, but stewards, and a crown of stewardship, when betrayed, becomes a crown of thorns. From the damp lowlands of England, we travel south to the sun-scorched plains of Iberia during the tumultuous centuries of Visigothic rule. Here, amidst the ruins of Roman temples and the rise of a new Christian faith, we find our second artifact of dread, the diadem of whispers. This was not a crown of kingship in the traditional sense, but a delicate, almost ethereal circlet of hammered silver, fashioned in the pre-Roman style. It was adorned with intricate filigree meant to resemble coiling serpents, and at its center sat a single, milky white moonstone. It was a thing of subtle, haunting beauty, designed not for a warrior king, but for the high priestess of a forgotten earth goddess. It was an object of divination, a tool for listening to the voices of the old gods who dwelt in the streams, the mountains, and the ancient groves. The curse of this diadem was not one of physical blight, but of psychological warfare. The entity bound to it was a collective consciousness, the lingering, resentful spirits of the gods whose shrines had been desecrated and whose followers had been forcibly converted. Their motivation was a slow, patient, and utterly devastating revenge. They sought not to kill the body, but to poison the mind, to unravel a dynasty from within by exploiting the very flaws of human nature. The diadem's primary supernatural ability was to amplify the faintest seeds of doubt, paranoia, and suspicion in the wearer's mind, and to give them voice. It did not create thoughts, but rather caught the stray, dark whispers of the subconscious, a fleeting worry about a brother's ambition, a flicker of mistrust in a loyal general, and played them back as if they were external, objective truths. It was a relentless, soul-eroding echo chamber, custom-fit to the anxieties of the one who wore it. The diadem's profane history began in the 6th century, under the reign of King Leovigild, a powerful but ruthless Visigothic monarch intent on unifying the peninsula under his Arian Christian faith. During a campaign to suppress a pagan rebellion in the northern mountains, his soldiers sacked a remote, hidden temple dedicated to a tripartite goddess of the moon, the hunt, and the underworld. In the central sanctum, they found the high priestess, an old woman who refused to flee. As she was cut down, she uttered a curse upon the king, not of fire or plague, but of doubt. "You seek to silence our gods," she was said to have rasped. "Instead, you shall hear them for all time. They will speak in your halls, in your council, and in your bed. They will turn your love to poison and your trust to dust." Leovigild, contemptuous of her faith, took the silver diadem from her cooling brow as a spoil of war. He later had it refashioned, removing some of the more overt pagan symbols and presenting it as a gift to his beloved wife, Queen Theodosia. The queen, a devout Christian, was at first hesitant to wear the pagan relic, but its beauty was undeniable. The first time she wore it to court, she felt nothing but a strange, faint chill. But that night, as she lay beside the king, she heard a sound, faint as the rustle of silk, a whisper that seemed to come from the very air around her. It spoke the king's name, followed by the name of a young, handsome courtier. It was a fleeting, insidious suggestion. She dismissed it as a waking dream. But she wore the diadem again, and the whispers grew bolder. They began to twist the king's words. When he spoke of a political alliance, the diadem whispered of a secret pact to betray her. When he praised a general for his loyalty, the whispers recounted a litany of imagined slights, painting the man as a traitor in waiting. Queen Theodosia, once a confident and beloved figure, became haunted and withdrawn. She began to see conspiracy in every corner, her accusations growing ever more wild. Leovigild, bewildered by his wife's transformation, attributed it to a sickness of the mind. He took the diadem from her, hoping to ease her suffering, and in a moment of vanity or curiosity, placed it upon his own head. For him, the whispers were different. They did not speak of infidelity, but of rebellion. They preyed upon his fears of a divided kingdom. His eldest son, Hermenegild, who had converted to Chalcedonian Christianity and married a Frankish princess, became the focus of the diadem's venom. Every letter from his son was reinterpreted by the whispers as coded treason. Every plea for reconciliation was twisted into a cunning political maneuver. The diadem told Leovigild what he secretly feared, that his own son was his greatest enemy. This phantom council led to a real and tragic civil war. Leovigild, driven by the ceaseless murmurs of the Silver Circlet, marched against his own child. He besieged Seville, and after a brutal campaign, captured Hermenegild. The historical records state that Hermenegild was executed in prison a year later for refusing to renounce his faith. But the legend insists that the final order was given by a king tormented by whispers, a man who could no longer distinguish the voice of his own paranoia from the advice of his counselors. Leovigild unified his kingdom, but he had shattered his family. He died a powerful but broken man, and the diadem was passed to his successor. For over a century, the diadem of whispers remained within the Visigothic treasury. It was worn by a succession of short-lived kings whose reigns were marked by an astonishing degree of internecine conflict, assassination, and betrayal. The Visigothic kingdom, despite its military strength, seemed incapable of establishing a stable dynasty, constantly devouring itself from within. The final wearer, the legend claims, was King Roderick, who wore it into battle at the fateful encounter with the invading Umayyad forces at the Guadalete River. It is said that in the heat of the fight, the diadem whispered to him of betrayal in his own ranks, causing him to make a fatal tactical error. He was slain, his kingdom collapsed, and the diadem of whispers vanished into the chaos of the conquest, its terrible work complete. The diadem of whispers serves as a chilling psychological allegory for the destructive power of confirmation bias and internal paranoia. The curse is a supernatural manifestation of a very real human frailty, our tendency to seek out and amplify information that confirms our deepest fears and prejudices. The diadem is a mirror for the wearer's soul, but it is a distorted, funhouse mirror that reflects only the ugliest parts. For Queen Theodosia, it reflected her insecurities about love and loyalty. For King Leovigild, it reflected his political anxieties about rebellion and succession. The whispers are not external demonic voices. They are the wearer's own inner monologue, weaponized. The diadem's true power is its ability to sever the connection between an individual and external reality, trapping them in a solipsistic prison where their worst fears are the only truth. It symbolizes how unchecked power, combined with deep-seated insecurity, inevitably leads to self-destruction. The fall of the Visigothic kingdom, in this interpretation, was not merely a historical event, but the logical conclusion of a ruling class that had lost its ability to trust, poisoned by the whispers of its own ambition and fear. The relevance of this legend in the modern age of information, or more accurately, misinformation, is profoundly unsettling. We no longer need a cursed silver diadem to be trapped in an echo chamber. Our social media feeds, our personalized news algorithms, our political bubbles all serve the same function as the diadem of whispers. They're designed to listen to our biases and fears, and then whisper them back to us, amplified and validated, disguised as objective news or popular opinion. We see societies, families, and individuals being torn apart by algorithmically generated paranoia, where trust is eroded and every opposing viewpoint is framed as a malicious conspiracy. The legend cautions us that the most effective prison is not one with iron bars, but one built from the whispers we want to believe. It is a timeless warning that the greatest threat to any power, whether a kingdom or an individual's peace of mind, is the inability to distinguish the voice of wisdom from the seductive echo of our own fear. The diadem may be gone, but its curse is everywhere. We now move from the fractured courts of Iberia to the dark, forested heartland of Central Europe, within the fragmented tapestry of the Holy Roman Empire. Here, amidst warring duchies and ambitious princelings, we encounter a crown not of elegance or sacred pact, but of brute force and cosmic dread, the Iron Crown of the usurper. This was a formidable, unadorned band of blackened metal, rumored to have been forged not from terrestrial ore, but from the heart of a fallen star, a meteorite that had blazed across the night sky and buried itself in a mountain deep within the Black Forest. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally heavy, and seemed to absorb the light around it. It was a crown that promised not wisdom or divine right, but a single, seductive quality: invincibility. The malevolent force at work within this crown was a form of cosmic nihilism, an alien emptiness born of the void between worlds. Its motivation was not revenge or justice, but consumption. It was a parasitic entity that offered a perfect shield for the body in exchange for the entirety of the soul. It did not whisper or blight the land. It performed a slow, metaphysical lobotomy, hollowing out the wearer's humanity, their capacity for joy, grief, love, and ambition, until nothing remained but a breathing automaton, a flesh and blood puppet occupying a throne. Its supernatural power was twofold. It rendered the wearer physically impervious to harm, turning aside blades and ignoring poisons, but also systematically erased their spirit, their very essence, leaving behind an immortal, unkillable, and utterly empty shell. The crown's dark legend began with an act of profound betrayal. In the 12th century, the small but wealthy Duchy of Swabia was ruled by Duke Gottfried, a just and beloved leader. His cousin, Conrad, was a man consumed by a ravenous jealousy. Conrad had heard the legends of the star-fallen iron and the crown that had been forged from it by ancient smiths, a relic hidden away due to its dangerous power. He spent years searching for it and finally found it in a forgotten monastery. Believing himself destined for greatness, he took the crown and orchestrated a coup. During a hunt, he ambushed and murdered Duke Gottfried, staining the forest floor with his cousin's blood. He rode back to the capital, declared Gottfried the victim of a tragic accident, and, with the support of a few key allies, placed the iron crown upon his own head and declared himself duke. At his coronation, a loyal knight of the old duke, seeing the truth of the usurpation, drew his sword and lunged at Conrad. The blade, a masterwork of sharpened steel, struck Conrad square in the chest. But instead of piercing flesh, it shattered against his body as if striking an anvil, the shards clattering harmlessly to the stone floor. The court gasped in awe and terror. This single act solidified Conrad's rule. He was seen as divinely protected, invincible. He ruled with an iron fist, secure in the knowledge that no assassin's blade could touch him. For the first few years, he reveled in his power. He feasted, he conquered neighboring lands, he indulged every whim. But slowly, a change began to creep over him. The change was not dramatic, but insidious. His hearty laugh became a hollow echo. The food he once devoured with gusto now tasted of ash. The thrill of victory in battle faded into a dull, procedural chore. His passions, his rage, his love for his own children, all began to recede like a slow tide, leaving behind a barren shoreline of indifference. He would sit on his throne for hours, his eyes vacant, staring at nothing. His council would debate matters of state, and he would nod or shake his head, his decisions becoming increasingly arbitrary, devoid of strategy or feeling. The crown on his head felt no different. It was drinking him dry, consuming every spark of his personality to fuel its invulnerable shield. Decades passed. Conrad did not age. While his contemporaries grew old and gray, he remained a man in his prime, his body untouched by time or disease. But he was a statue of a man. His wife grew old and died. He watched her funeral with the dispassionate curiosity of a stranger. His children grew to resent this cold, unfeeling father, plotted against him, and were executed for treason. He signed their death warrants with a steady, untroubled hand. He outlived his friends, his enemies, his grandchildren. He became a living monument, a permanent fixture on the throne of Swabia. The duchy, once vibrant, began to stagnate under his empty reign. There was no progress, no art, no joy, only the cold, efficient, and pointless administration of an immortal husk. The people began to call him Conrad the Empty. He was their unkillable curse, a king who could not die, but who had ceased to live a century ago. The physical evidence of his reign was a kingdom frozen in time, and a man whose chronicle spanned 150 years, yet contained no record of him smiling after the first decade. He simply was, a body on a throne, wearing an iron crown, waiting for a world that had long since moved on. The iron crown of the usurper is a powerful existential metaphor for the Faustian bargain of pursuing power for its own sake. It explores the philosophical concept of a Pyrrhic victory, where the battle is won, but the very thing being fought for is lost in the process. Conrad seeks ultimate security and control, symbolized by the crown's gift of invincibility. What he receives, however, is not true power, but the ultimate prison, an eternal, meaningless existence. The crown represents a purely materialistic and nihilistic form of power, one divorced from purpose, relationship, and humanity. The curse is the logical endpoint of this pursuit. When a leader's sole aim is self-preservation and the maintenance of their position, they must inevitably sacrifice the very qualities, empathy, vision, passion, vulnerability, that make leadership meaningful. Conrad's spiritual decay is a dramatization of how an obsession with control can hollow a person out, leaving only the machinery of authority with no ghost in it. He becomes the perfect bureaucrat, the ultimate dictator, untouchable, unfeeling, and utterly pointless. This legend speaks directly to a modern anxiety about the dehumanizing nature of systems and institutions. In a world increasingly dominated by vast, impersonal corporations, faceless bureaucracies, and the cold logic of algorithms, the story of Conrad the Empty is the story of the individual soul lost within the machine. We see leaders and figures of authority who seem to operate with a chilling detachment, their decisions driven by metrics and profit margins rather than human consequence. The Iron Crown today could be seen as the rigid ideology or the corporate mandate that grants an individual institutional power but demands the sacrifice of their personal conscience and empathy. The legend serves as a stark reminder that true strength is not found in invulnerability, but in the very human capacity for connection and feeling. It warns that in our quest to build indestructible systems and secure our own positions within them, we risk becoming the ghosts that haunt our own creations, presiding over stagnant kingdoms of our own making, immortal in our irrelevance. Let us now journey eastward into the mist-shrouded peaks and shadowed valleys of the Carpathian Mountains, a region where the veil between worlds has always been perilously thin. In a small, forgotten principality nestled among these formidable crags, there existed a relic of exquisite terror, the Garland of Thorns. This was not a crown of state, but a personal torment, a circlet woven from the petrified vines of the nightshade plant, harvested from a grove where, according to local folklore, a great tragedy had poisoned the very soil. The vines were gray and hard as stone, and from them grew needle-sharp thorns of obsidian black. It was not a symbol of power to be displayed, but a tool of foresight to be endured, for it was said to grant the wearer visions of the future. The entity at the heart of this crown was not a spirit or a demon, but a far more abstract and cruel force, the philosophical principle of fatalism itself. The crown was an oracle, but its motivation was to demonstrate the utter futility of choice and the inescapable nature of sorrow. Its singular, devastating power was to show the wearer multiple paths into the future, but with a terrible caveat. It would only ever reveal the tragic, painful, or disastrous outcomes of any decision. It presented a future composed entirely of lesser evils. It would show a king that if he went to war, his son would die in battle. But if he chose peace, a plague would ravage his kingdom. If he executed a traitor, the man's family would raise a rebellion. But if he showed mercy, the traitor would strike again, killing the queen. It was a crown that offered omniscience, but only of despair, turning the burden of leadership into an exercise in choosing the instrument of one's own misery. The garland's creation was tied to the story of Princess Ilona, a young woman with the gift of second sight. She fell in love with a man her father, the prince, forbade her to marry. When they tried to elope, they were caught. In his rage, the prince had her lover executed before her eyes. Overwhelmed by a vision of all the future happiness that had just been stolen from her, Ilona fled into the forest and, in her grief, hanged herself from a nightshade vine. The legend states that her despair was so profound it seeped into the plant, petrifying it and infusing it with her cursed foresight. Years later, her guilt-stricken father, haunted by his actions, retrieved the thorny vine, had it fashioned into a circlet, and wore it, hoping to somehow commune with his daughter's spirit. Instead, it showed him the terrible future his actions had wrought, a future of dynastic collapse, invasion, and the ruin of his line, all stemming from that one act of cruelty. He was the first to experience its curse. Centuries later, the Garland of Thorns came into the possession of a young and idealistic ruler, Prince Valeru. He was a good man, a philosopher king who genuinely wished for the prosperity and happiness of his people. He learned of the Garland's power and, in an act of profound hubris, believed he could master it. He thought that by knowing the worst possible outcomes, he could cleverly navigate a path to the best ones. He donned the crown in a secret ritual, the sharp thorns pricking his brow and drawing blood. Immediately, his mind was flooded. He saw a drought coming in 2 years. The vision showed him the consequences of his choices with agonizing clarity. If he did nothing, thousands would starve. If he began rationing food now, his people would resent him and his nobles would plot to overthrow him. If he used the treasury to import grain, he would bankrupt the state, leaving it vulnerable to its rapacious neighbors. The garland showed him starving children, the glint of an assassin's knife, and the triumphant banners of a foreign army. It offered no solution, only a menu of failures. Valeru chose to import the grain. He saved his people from the famine, but as the garland had foretold, his coffers were emptied. A neighboring baron, seeing his weakness, immediately declared war. Valeru, a man who loathed violence, now had to lead his nation in a conflict he knew he could not properly fund. He consulted the garland again. It showed him two paths. If he led the army himself, he would be slain in the first battle, and his kingdom would be overrun. If he sent his younger, more popular brother, a brilliant commander, his brother would win a great victory, but would be so beloved by the army that he would return and usurp the throne, imprisoning Valeru for life. Every night, Valeru would wear the crown, and every night it would show him fresh hells. The faces of his loyal soldiers dying because of his poor equipment, the sneer on his brother's face as the prison door slammed shut. The constant exposure to future griefs eroded his spirit. His idealism curdled into a bleak, depressive cynicism. He became hesitant, indecisive, his every action shadowed by the knowledge of the pain it would inevitably cause. His council saw only a weak, vacillating ruler. His people, who had once adored him, began to whisper that he was cursed. He grew gaunt and pale, the lines of worry on his face deepening into chasms of despair. The small pricks from the thorns on his brow never seemed to heal. In the end, facing the invading army and the threat of his brother's ambition, he saw a third, final vision offered by the garland, a vision of himself, alone in his chambers, finding a permanent escape from the tyranny of choice. He abdicated the throne, leaving a note that spoke of a burden of knowledge too great for any mortal man to bear, and took his own life. The garland of thorns was found lying on the table beside him, looking inert and harmless, its terrible work of philosophical instruction complete. The garland of thorns is a chilling meditation on the nature of free will, determinism, and the immense psychological burden of leadership. The crown is a metaphor for the terrifying weight of consequence. While most leaders must make decisions with incomplete information, Valeru is cursed with an excess of it, but it is information of a uniquely poisonous kind. The legend probes a terrifying philosophical question. If you knew that all your available choices led to suffering, could you truly be said to be free? The curse is not supernatural in the traditional sense. It is the curse of pure, unfiltered reality, stripped of all hope and optimism. It symbolizes the idea that at a certain level of responsibility, there are no good choices, only different species of loss. Valeru's downfall is not caused by a monster or a ghost, but by the intellectual and emotional paralysis that comes from seeing the causal chain of sorrow too clearly. It is an allegory for the depression and anxiety that can overwhelm those in power, who must constantly weigh human lives and futures in a balance that never truly settles. In our modern, data-saturated age, the garland of thorns has a particularly sharp and poignant relevance. We are inundated with information, with predictive models, with risk analyses that constantly forecast potential disasters, economic collapse, climate catastrophe, social upheaval. Like Prince Valeru, our leaders are presented with an endless stream of worst-case scenarios. The legend serves as a cautionary tale about the paralysis that can stem from information overload and a focus on purely negative outcomes. It suggests that leadership requires not just knowledge, but also hope, faith, and the courage to act in the face of uncertainty and potential failure. It warns that a society or an individual that becomes obsessed only with mitigating risk and avoiding pain will ultimately lose the ability to strive for joy and create a better future. The garland reminds us that while foresight is a powerful tool, a vision that sees only the darkness is not a gift, but a curse that will lead only to despair and inaction. For our final artifact, we journey south to the sun-drenched hills of Renaissance Italy, a landscape of cutthroat ambition, breathtaking art, and mercantile genius. In a city-state grown powerful on trade and banking, we find the legend of the sovereign's debt, a crown whose curse was not of the spirit or the mind, but of economics and fortune itself. The crown was a masterpiece of the goldsmith's art, a heavy circlet of the purest gold, ostentatiously encrusted with enormous diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. It was a vulgar display of wealth, a crown designed to awe and intimidate, to scream its owner's prosperity to the world. But its beauty was a facade, for the crown was a predatory financial instrument, a Faustian bargain made manifest. The entity bound to this crown was an ancient, amoral force that personified the principle of debt. It was conceived in folklore not as a demon, but as a kind of metaphysical banker or lender, utterly indifferent to good or evil, concerned only with the balancing of accounts. Its motivation was to provide its wearer with boundless fortune, ambition, and success, allowing them to achieve their wildest dreams, but all on credit. The crown's supernatural ability was to manipulate probability and fortune. For the wearer, trade routes would miraculously open, rival states would fall into civil war, and bountiful harvests would fill the granaries. It amplified ambition and rewarded it with spectacular success. However, for every unit of fortune it granted, it accrued a hidden debt with compounding interest. When a mysterious lender decided the debt was due, it would collect not in gold, but by reclaiming the very prosperity it had granted, leaving the wearer and their kingdom utterly bankrupt in every sense of the word. The crown story begins with Duke Alessandro, the ruler of a minor but ambitious city-state. He was a man of great vision but limited means, his treasury constantly depleted by wars with his more powerful neighbors. One night, a mysterious visitor arrived at his court, a man cloaked in shadow who called himself simply the creditor. He offered the Duke a deal. He would provide the gold and gems for a new crown, a crown that would ensure Alessandro's success and make his city the envy of all Italy. The price was not in money, but a simple contract. The crown and the fortune it brought were merely a loan, to be recalled at the creditor's discretion. Desperate and ambitious, Alessandro agreed. The next day, a chest arrived containing the most magnificent jewels and purest gold he had ever seen. He commissioned the crown, and the moment he placed it on his head, his fortunes changed. The effect was immediate and miraculous. A rival merchant fleet was destroyed in a freak storm, leaving Alessandro's ships to monopolize the lucrative spice trade. A silver mine, thought to be exhausted for decades, suddenly revealed a rich new vein. His military campaigns were blessed with uncanny luck. Enemy generals made foolish mistakes, and sieges ended in improbable victories. Alessandro's city-state grew at an astonishing rate. He became a great patron of the arts, his court filled with the finest painters and architects. He built a grand cathedral, paved his city's streets with marble, and his people enjoyed a golden age of prosperity. The crown blazed on his head, a symbol of his Midas touch. He forgot all about his pact, dismissing the cloaked visitor as a strange dream. He ruled for 40 years, a reign of unparalleled success, dying peacefully in his bed, hailed as the greatest ruler his city had ever known. The crown passed to his son, Giovanni, a man who inherited his father's ambition but lacked his genius. Yet with the crown on his head, it did not matter. His foolish ventures turned to gold. His poorly planned wars ended in victory. The city's luck held. The people began to believe they were divinely favored, their prosperity a sign of their own inherent virtue. But the invisible debt grew, the interest compounding through a second generation of effortless success. It was Giovanni's son, Lorenzo, who would pay the price. Lorenzo was a wastrel, a man who believed the family's fortune was an infinite, natural resource. He wore the crown to gaudy festivals and spent the state's wealth on frivolous luxuries. One night, 50 years to the day from when Alessandro made his pact, the cloaked creditor appeared again in the ducal palace. He did not ask for money. He simply announced, "The loan is now due." The next morning, the reversal of fortune began. The silver mine collapsed in a catastrophic flood. The city's main bank, thought to be the most stable in Italy, was revealed to be a hollow shell, its investments worthless. A virulent plague, which had bypassed the city for a century, suddenly appeared in the harbor, sweeping through the crowded streets. The city's mercenary army, unpaid, switched allegiance overnight and laid siege to the very walls they were hired to protect. It was a perfect storm of calamity. Everything that could go wrong did. Lorenzo, wearing the crown, found it felt cold and impossibly heavy. It no longer amplified his ambition. It amplified his despair. He could see no way out. Within a year, his prosperous, beautiful city was a smoking ruin, its people scattered, its wealth vanished, its art plundered. Lorenzo was killed by a starving mob, his opulent crown trampled into the mud, its jewels pried out by desperate hands. The creditor had collected his debt in full, repossessing not just the gold, but the luck, the life, and the future of an entire kingdom. The sovereign's debt is a potent sociological and economic allegory about the dangers of unsustainable growth and the illusion of perpetual prosperity. The crown is a metaphor for a speculative bubble or a debt-based economy. It provides the appearance of immense value and success, but this prosperity is illusory, built on a foundation of borrowed fortune that must eventually be repaid. Duke Alessandro represents the ambitious innovator who takes a massive risk that pays off spectacularly, creating a boom. His successors represent the generations who inherit this boom, taking it for granted and believing it to be the new, permanent state of affairs. The curse is simply the market correction, the inevitable bust that follows the boom, but dramatized as a single, catastrophic supernatural event. The mysterious creditor is the personification of systemic risk, the unseen force that underwrites the prosperity but can call on the debt at any time, causing a complete system collapse. The legend is a cautionary tale about confusing luck with skill and borrowed wealth with earned value. This fable from Renaissance Italy is perhaps the most resonant of all in our contemporary globalized world. Our modern economic systems are built upon vast and complex edifices of debt, national debt, corporate debt, consumer credit. We have experienced periods of incredible, seemingly miraculous growth, fueled by leveraging future earnings. The legend of the sovereign's debt serves as a chilling warning about the potential fragility of this system. It asks a terrifying question: what happens when the debt is called in? The story's depiction of a swift and total collapse, financial, social, and ecological, mirrors modern fears of a black swan event that could trigger a global systemic crisis. It reminds us that fortunes built on speculation and unsustainable practices are fragile. The crown, gleaming with borrowed wealth, is a symbol for any asset whose value is inflated beyond its reality. It warns that true, lasting prosperity must be built on a foundation more solid than a promise to pay tomorrow for the luxuries we enjoy today. For someday, the creditor always arrives to collect. And so, our journey through the haunted vaults of European monarchy draws to its close. We have walked the blighted fens of an Anglo-Saxon king, punished for his arrogance against the earth. We have stood in the Visigothic courts of Iberia, where a silver diadem turned a king's own mind against him, breeding a paranoia that tore a kingdom apart. We have witnessed the living death of the usurper duke, granted immortality by a crown of star-fallen iron at the cost of his very soul. We have felt the despair of the Carpathian prince, forced by the garland of thorns to gaze only upon the future sorrows. And finally, we have seen the glittering ruin of an Italian city-state, whose fortune, borrowed from a supernatural creditor, was recalled with devastating interest. What, then, is the singular truth these relics impart? What wisdom have we gleaned from these tales of cursed gold and haunted iron? It is this, that a crown is never just an object. It is a mirror. It does not corrupt the wearer. It reflects and magnifies what is already there. To the arrogant, it reflects the wrath of the world he seeks to dominate. To the paranoid, it gives voice to his deepest fears. To the soulless usurper, it grants an existence as empty as his own ambition. To the idealist, it reflects the unbearable weight of consequence. And to the gambler, it mirrors the terrifying volatility of the fortune he worships. These legends endure not because they tell us about magical objects, but because they tell us about the unchanging frailties of human nature when confronted with absolute power. The unified meaning that emerges from these disparate legends is a profound and sobering one. It is the realization that true sovereignty lies not in the circlet of metal one wears upon the head, but in the mastery of the self. The curses are externalizations of internal failures, the failure of stewardship, the failure of trust, the failure of purpose, the failure of hope, and the failure of prudence. Power, these stories insist, is a crucible that burns away all illusion, leaving only the essential character of the one who wields it. The weight of a crown is not the weight of gold, but the weight of accountability to one's land, one's people, one's history, and ultimately to one's self. A broken oath, a cruel act, a moment of profound hubris. These are the things that truly curse a crown, turning a symbol of glory into an instrument of a long and terrible reckoning. By bearing witness to these tales, by carrying their lessons forward, you do more than simply consume a story. You become a keeper of an ancient and necessary wisdom. In an age that often dismisses such folklore as primitive superstition, you recognize it for what it is, a vital archive of human experience, a series of cautionary notes left for us by our ancestors. For this, I extend my gratitude. To continue this solemn work and to ensure these echoes from the past are not lost to the noise of the present, I urge you to subscribe to our channel. Share these stories with those who you believe would appreciate their weight and their warning. And leave your final thoughts in the comments, for our shared understanding is enriched by every voice. The archives are deep, and the number of such stories is legion. There are yet rings that breed jealousy, swords that thirst for blood, and thrones that reject unworthy occupants. Our explorations have only just begun. I shall continue to be your faithful guide through these shadowed corridors of what was and what might be, for as long as you wish to walk them with me. The legends are not dead things. They are sleeping, waiting for new generations to reawaken them and find in their ancient verses a new and startling relevance. Until our next congregation, may you find wisdom in the shadows and clarity in the echoes of the past. May your nights be free from the whispers of paranoia and your days unburdened by the weight of a debtor's crown. For we have learned a solemn truth tonight. The best monsters and the most terrifying curses are always the ones that show us something true about ourselves. The heaviest crowns are not forged of gold, but of consequence. Now, there's only the silence of the empty throne room, the dust motes dancing in a final, slivered beam of moonlight, and the lingering question of who will be brave or foolish enough to sit there next.